Will you state your name, please?
Jeff Fort.
It was a summer day in 1968 that Jeff Fort was called to testify in Washington, D.C. before an investigating subcommittee of the United States Senate. But why was a Chicago gang leader the focus of national attention and debate? To answer that question, one has to go back to Woodlawn.
Jeff Fort, the public face of the Blackstone Street Gang, first gained recognition in a Chicago Tribune article titled, "Teens Given Fresh Start," published in April 1965. The following year, in August 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. led a march through Chicago's Marquette Park neighborhood to demand equal housing. Dr. King called the Marquette Park March the first step on a 1,000-mile journey.
During these marches, King and other demonstrators were struck by bricks and bottles.
Oh, I've been hit so many times, I'm immune to it.
How do you feel about this reception, sir?
Well, this is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen in Chicago.
Bishop Arthur Brazier.
We were desperate. We were trying to do something about a situation that was literally destroying this community.
The shooting, the killing, the turf wars in Woodlawn just would not stop. Those wars, in turn, spawned another kind of combat, a fight over how to stop the gangs. The battle lines were drawn, community leaders against politicians, cops against clergy, liberals against conservatives. And the lightning rod of this conflict was a man by the name of John Fry.
John Fry was a very prophetic man, a really, truly prophetic man.
We felt that Reverend Fry was very similar to Hitler.
It was John Fry who gave Jeff Fort's gang a home. John Fry was the minister at the First Presbyterian Church of Woodlawn, and he let the Blackstone Rangers use his church as their base of operation.
Reverend Fry gave us the use of the church, not willingly. We tied Reverend Fry up for 4 days. He didn't really want to bow down and give the church to us.
You physically tied him up for 4 days?
Physically tied him up and fed him.
For 4 days?
For 4 days.
Why?
He didn't want drugs and guns in his church.
And so John Fry, you're telling me, was afraid of you and let you have what you wanted?
The man was afraid.
Charles LaPaglia, Fry's associate, says that is a lie and that many lies were told about him and Fry and what was going on at the First Presbyterian Church. John Fry, meanwhile, would argue the gangs were not the problem in Woodlawn, society was.
I think that it is really society that is killing black people.
I think John believed that the Stones had some function beyond being a gang.
I don't think that they would have reached the significance they did had it not been for the First Presbyterian Church and the Reverend John Fry.
He believed that they could be a constructive force in their own community.
But could John Fry's vision of greater opportunity alter the course of the Blackstone Rangers and Jeff Fort? Father Tracy O'Sullivan.
I think John Fry was very creative and committed and a passionate sense of justice. At the same time, I think John Fry was not open to compromise, did not see the complexity of the situation, was not able to see that Jeff Fort and the others were not all good guys, that they weren't straight out angelic. I constantly asked the questions, well, fine, but what about the killings? That was the constant question we had. We never got to a point where the violence stopped.
My office was bombarded constantly by families, by clergymen, asking us what was TWO going to do about the gang problem. Every effort to break up these gangs, youth groups, they all failed.
So you were seeking some way to learn to live with them and for them to learn to live with you?
And so they could make a positive contribution to the community.
At the same time that John Fry was reaching out to the Blackstone Rangers, Arthur Brazier of the Apostolic Church of God had just become the head of the fledgling Woodlawn organization. Brazier's contribution was to get, despite the objections of Mayor Richard J. Daley, a federal grant worth $1 million. The idea was to use the money to teach both the Blackstone Rangers and the Eastside Disciples job skills, and to use the leadership of those gangs to help run the program, to try to channel that leadership into constructive avenues,
where they can be a benefit to the community rather than a detriment.
It was a bona fide effort to try to take these gangs that were shooting one another down in the street. The police were unable to deal with it, and to try to take them as they were and try to refocus their ideas on something much more constructive. It was an experimental program.
An experiment worth pursuing because the gang war was intense, because business was being extorted to pay protection to the gangs, because Woodlawn was overcrowded, in racial transition and in turmoil. Something had to be done, but police were appalled at this particular approach, believing it was a naive, liberal solution to a deeply criminal problem. Chicago Police Superintendent Leroy Martin was a resident of Woodlawn at the time.
I guess some of the people were very well-meaning people, but they just created a monster with the money that they gave them, no controls on it.
Police Commander Edward Buckney believed the gangs had become the darlings of liberal America, people who didn't understand the gangs' real motive.
They were in it for the money and whatever other gains could be gotten. You know, anytime you can have somebody like W. Clement Stone give them money, the Sears Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Weibold Foundation, the Kettering Foundation, and all of these kinds of things. And they would, you know, if somebody's constantly giving you money, do you ever think in terms of getting a job? Hell no. And they didn't.
Talk to me about money.
Money. I had a lot to do with getting money to the Blackstone Ranger organization. And if I have any shortcoming, I just didn't get enough money to the organization, because what I got to them, they used incredibly well.
Ben Davis, a PhD from the University of Chicago, was one of a number, including John Fry, who believed that police were oppressive, unjust, and only fueling the violence in Woodlawn. Some of the foundation money Davis would get for Jeff Ford and the Blackstone Rangers would be to bond them out of jail and hire lawyers for them. And do you have any regrets about that?
None.
You had a lot of respect for Jeff Ford.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He is one of the rare human beings.
But the desperate search for alternatives only inflamed the situation. Jeff Ford and the Blackstone Rangers would use the First Presbyterian Church to make and store weapons. Police believe Fry and LaPaglia knew that.
No doubt about it at all.
There are still people today who claim, whether you knew it or not, First Presbyterian was functionally an arsenal. There were guns in there, that there were drugs in there, that there were illegal things going on in there. They're not entirely wrong, are they?
That illegal things probably went on. No, I'm sure there were illegal things that went on in there that we weren't aware of. I'm sure, you know, I mean, weapons were certainly something that was rampant in that community. But our position was to try and disarm and the kids and to cut the violence as much as we possibly can.
And what kind of weapons would you keep in that church?
Carbines, submachine guns, 9mm, you name it.
Meanwhile, over at the job training program, equally intense controversy. Gang members would be paid to come to a job training class taught in large part by gang leaders. There would be immediate charges of gang leaders getting kickbacks.
When the gang members would go to these job classes, how would that work?
Everybody would go to school and get a check, and in turn they would kick back so much of their money.
So there was always a kickback?
Right.
Were there legitimately some kids in those classes in it to learn job skills who later went on to get jobs?
Yeah. Some of them was really serious about it.
Were any of the leadership in the category of serious, hardworking students?
No. Not that I recall.
The program just wasn't working. That was the conclusion of a study done by Dr. Irving Spergel of the University of Chicago. And the reason had as much to do with the adults as the gangs.
It seems to me that the most serious problem with that project was the context, in that you had major conflict among organizations.
For instance?
Well, you had some elements in the political structure that agreed with the project ideas and were supporting it, and some that were opposed to it violently.
Different political leaders had different points of view about it. There was a struggle on every level.
And the gangs had a field day.
Particularly the Black Pea Stone Nation and Jeff Fort, who, because of the Spergel study and because of the public outcry, would be brought before the McClellan Committee in Washington, a Senate subcommittee investigating whether $1 million in federal money had been misspent and whether Woodlawn had become a fortress for the gangs. Jeff Fort was called to explain himself to that committee. After stating his name, he walked out. In the years to come, he would be convicted of contempt of Congress charges and the misuse of federal money. But that would hardly mean the end of Jeff Fort or the debate over who he was.
In 1966, Dr. King moved his family into Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood at 1550 North Hamlin, 2 blocks away from the headquarters of the conservative Vice Lord Street Gang, and the NAACP filed the first lawsuit with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Take this beautiful city that sits on the banks of Lake Michigan, the beautiful city of brotherhood that it is called to be.
The lawsuit developed from the case of 2 African Americans that claimed Chicago realtors only showed them homes in black communities. On July 10, 1966, Dr. King held an event in Chicago's Soldier Field. Speeches by civil rights leaders dominated the day, and musical acts like Stevie Wonder and Mahalia Jackson performed for the crowd. At some point during the event, the Blackstones suddenly marched into the uppermost deck of the stadium. They completely surrounded the venue, carrying a huge banner with a picture of a .50 caliber machine gun. As rumbles of unease ran through the stadium, the CVL members in attendance overheard a conversation between King's supporters. One of King's men would say he didn't feel that he needed all these gang fighters, because they weren't going to do nothing but disrupt the rally. Another of King's men, Reverend Al Sampson, told him it wasn't his place to decide on who you needed and how to get things done. Upset by the perceived disrespect, the gangs left the rally. Knowing he would need their help, King subsequently met with members of the CVL and the Blackstones, and convinced them to join him in his open housing marches. Dr. King and the Blackstones would face political opposition from Mayor Richard Daley, who wanted to maintain control of federal spending in his city. Some view Dr. King's time in Chicago in 1966 as a failure, while others say it brought national attention to the issue of segregation in northern states. In 1967, the Woodlawn Organization received nearly $1 million in grant money, and members of the Blackstones were paid $45 a week, while their chief, Jeff Fort, was paid an annual salary of $6,000. Despite this fact, the gang violence continued throughout 1967, but Jeff Fort was getting cream, dollar bills y'all, and was also getting a lot of positive recognition for keeping things cool in Chicago, when race riots flared throughout the country. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, set off a powder keg of frustration in urban areas across the country, including Chicago. The CVL walked through the crowds of North Lawndale, for the purported purpose of protecting black residents and their property. In reality, they were among many black rioters targeting white establishments, while the CVL protected black-owned businesses that paid. When the riot ended, the fires had been worse than the Great Chicago Fires in 1871, and most of the white stores were no longer in the neighborhood. Despite the fact that the South Side had not seen anywhere near the devastation as the West Side, allegations of extortion were levied against the Black Pea Stone Nation and its leader Jeff Fort. South Side business people claimed that they were approached by members of the BPSN and asked to pay $100 for placards that read, "Do not touch, BPSN, Jeff." The signs had 2 eyes indicating that the Blackstones were watching. Pause. We're going to pick up our series on Jeff Fort and the Black Pea Stone Nation in another video, where we explore the relationship between the BPSN and the Black Panther Party, and detail the Stones' war against the police. But before we do, please smash that like button and subscribe to the Cartoon News Network.